In the evening of May 2, 1863, the shots rang out in the Virginia darkness shortly after 9 o'clock. 3 struck into the flesh, and 1 shattered a bone. The man who fell from his horse was not a Union cavalryman. He was not an enemy scout probing Confederate lines. He was Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, commander of the 2nd Corps, Army of Northern Virginia. The men who fired were his own soldiers from the 18th North Carolina Infantry. In the span of seconds, the Confederate Army lost its most aggressive field commander to the nervous rifles of troops who could not distinguish friend from foe in the tangled wilderness. What followed was not merely the death of a general, it was the beginning of the end for Robert E. Lee's greatest victory. This is the story of how darkness, confusion, and the chaos of night warfare unraveled the most successful flank attack of the American Civil War. The Virginia wilderness in the spring of 1863 was a maze of second-growth timber, dense undergrowth, and narrow roads that twisted through forests so thick that cavalry could barely maneuver, and artillery had no field of fire beyond 50 yards. It was here, in this green labyrinth west of Fredericksburg, that Major General Joseph Hooker had positioned the Army of the Potomac, 130,000 men, arranged in a defensive arc around the crossroads hamlet of Chancellorsville. Hooker's plan had been sound. While a portion of his force demonstrated against Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, 3 corps would cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers upstream, sweep through the wilderness, and emerge onto the open ground beyond where Union numbers and artillery could decide the battle. By the morning of May 1st, the maneuver was complete. The Army of the Potomac held the initiative, but Robert E. Lee had not retreated. Instead, leaving 10,000 men under Major General Jubal Early to hold the Fredericksburg line, he had marched west with 43,000 Confederate troops to meet Hooker's advance. The two armies collided in the wilderness on May 1st. After a brief engagement, Hooker withdrew his forces to prepared positions around Chancellorsville. That evening, Lee and Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson met at the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and Orange Turnpike. The Confederate position was precarious. They were outnumbered 3-1. Hooker's defensive line stretched for nearly 4 miles, anchored on both flanks by the Rappahannock River. A frontal assault would be suicide. Jackson studied the maps by lamplight. His corps held the Confederate left, facing east toward the Union right flank commanded by Major General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps. Intelligence reports indicated that Howard's line terminated near a small church called Dowdall's Tavern, with no fortifications extending south toward the river. The Union right hung in the air unanchored, unprotected, vulnerable. Lee approved Jackson's proposal for a flanking march. The 2nd Corps would move at dawn on May 2nd, following a circuitous route through the wilderness to strike Howard's exposed flank. It was audacious to the point of recklessness, dividing an already outnumbered army in the face of the enemy. But it was also the only path to victory. Jackson's command numbered 28,000 men organized into 3 divisions under Major Generals Ambrose Powell Hill, Robert Rhodes, and Raleigh Colston. These were veteran troops, survivors of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, the 7 Days, 2nd Manassas, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. They had followed Jackson through forced marches that had earned them the nickname Foot Cavalry. They trusted him absolutely. The march began at 7:30 on the morning of May 2nd. Jackson's column stretched for 12 miles as it wound through narrow forest roads, following a route mapped by local guides. The Reverend Beverly Lacey, pastor of a nearby church, and Charles Welford, whose family had lived in the area for generations, led the way. They knew paths invisible to Union cartographers. For 6 hours, 28,000 Confederate soldiers moved through the wilderness largely undetected. Union pickets reported Confederate movement, but Hooker interpreted the intelligence as evidence of retreat. He was wrong. Jackson was not withdrawing. He was positioning his entire corps for a devastating surprise attack. By 3:00 the afternoon, Jackson's lead elements had reached the Orange Turnpike west of Dowdall's Tavern. The Union 11 Corps lay spread before them, soldiers cooking dinner, arms stacked, no preparation for attack. Howard's men faced south and east. Jackson was approaching from the west. The attack began at 5:15 p.m., with Rhodes' division advancing through the forest like a grey tide. The Union flank collapsed within minutes. Howard's corps, composed largely of German immigrants who spoke little English, could not understand the shouted orders as officers tried to organize a defense. Regiment after regiment broke and fled eastward toward Chancellorsville. For 2 hours, Jackson's corps rolled up the Union line. Artillery pieces were captured before they could be turned. Supply wagons blocked roads as teamsters whipped their horses in panic. The careful defensive positions Hooker had prepared around Chancellorsville began to crumble as thousands of routed soldiers streamed through them. But as darkness fell, the attack stalled. The forest that had concealed Jackson's approach now hindered his advance. Units became separated in the tangled undergrowth. Officers lost contact with their commands. The precise coordination that had marked the afternoon assault gave way to confusion and uncertainty. Jackson rode forward to assess the situation. His staff had urged him to halt for the night, but he could see the lights of Chancellorsville through the trees. The Union army was in retreat. One more push might complete the victory. But first, he needed to understand the ground ahead. At approximately 9 p.m., Jackson and his staff rode east along the Orange Plank Road to reconnoiter the Union positions. Behind them, nervous Confederate soldiers strained to see through the darkness, listening for sounds of enemy movement. The forest was alive with shadows and whispers. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves might signal a Union counterattack. Minutes later, the war's most aggressive corps commander lay bleeding in the Virginia mud, shot down by the men he had led to victory. The signs of disaster had been accumulating throughout the evening of May 2nd, invisible to the Confederate High Command, but evident to any soldier who understood the terrible mathematics of night fighting in close terrain. Jackson's corps had been advancing through the wilderness for nearly 4 hours when darkness fell. The forest that had screened their flanking march now became a trap. Units that had maintained perfect alignment during the daylight assault found themselves scattered across a front that stretched for miles. Company commanders lost contact with battalion headquarters. Battalion commanders could not locate their regimental colonels. The chain of command that bound 28,000 men into a coordinated fighting force began to fray. The 18th North Carolina Infantry, part of Brigadier General James Lane's brigade in Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's division, had been among the last units to enter the fight. They had spent the afternoon marching, listening to the sound of battle ahead, waiting for orders to advance. When their turn came, they pressed forward through undergrowth so dense that maintaining formation was impossible. Men became separated from their companies. Companies lost contact with their regiments. The regiment was armed with rifled muskets primarily, 58 caliber Springfield rifles, and 577 caliber Enfield rifles imported from Britain. These weapons were accurate to several hundred yards in daylight, but nearly useless in the darkness of the wilderness, where visibility extended no more than 20 yards in any direction. Captain John Douglas Barry commanded Company G of the 18th North Carolina. He was 26 years old, a lawyer from Charlotte who had enlisted as a private in 1861 and earned his commission through competence and courage displayed in a dozen battles. His company numbered 47 men when the evening advance began. By 9 p.m., he could account for perhaps 30. The others were scattered somewhere in the darkness behind them. Barry's immediate superior was Colonel Thomas Jefferson Purdy, a veteran officer who had commanded the regiment since its formation. But Purdy was nowhere to be found. The last Barry had seen of him was an hour earlier, when the colonel had ridden forward to coordinate with the regiment on their right. He had not returned. The 18th North Carolina had been ordered to establish a picket line along the Orange Plank Road, facing east toward the Union positions around Chancellorsville. The road itself was barely visible, a dirt track, perhaps 12 feet wide, rutted by artillery wheels and supply wagons. Dense forest pressed close on both sides. Barry positioned his men in a thin line north and south of the road. They lay prone behind fallen logs and in shallow depressions, muskets loaded and cocked. Every man had been instructed to challenge any approaching figures before firing, using whatever password had been established for the night. But in the chaos of the evening advance, the proper countersign had not been clearly communicated to all units. The psychological pressure was immense. These men had spent 4 hours in combat, advancing through terrain that channeled them into killing lanes where a single volley could devastate an entire company. They had seen regiments melt away in the tangled undergrowth. They had heard the screams of wounded men lying somewhere in the darkness, beyond reach of rescue. Reports had circulated throughout the afternoon of Union cavalry operating behind Confederate lines. Federal horsemen had been captured near the Plank Road. Confederate pickets had fired on mounted figures moving through the forest. The threat of enemy reconnaissance was real and immediate. At 8:30 p.m., Barry heard rifle fire from the south, scattered shots, not the concentrated volleys of a formed attack. Minutes later, a messenger found him in the darkness. Union cavalry had been spotted on the road south of the Plank Road. Confederate pickets were falling back. Barry was to maintain his position but be prepared for enemy contact. The warning spread along the picket line in whispers. Men shifted their positions, seeking better fields of fire. Nervous fingers caressed musket triggers. The darkness seemed to press closer. By 9 p.m., the situation had deteriorated further. A company from the 37th Virginia had wandered into Barry's sector, their captain claiming that Union infantry were advancing along a farm road 200 yards to the north. The Virginians took positions behind Barry's men, creating a second line of nervous soldiers straining to see through the darkness. Now they waited in positions they could barely see, facing an enemy they could not locate, with officers they could not find. The euphoria of victory had given way to the grinding tension of anticipation. Every shadow might conceal a Union soldier, every sound might herald an attack. When the sound of horses approached from the west from behind Confederate lines, Barry and his men had no way to distinguish between friendly officers returning from reconnaissance and enemy cavalry attempting to penetrate their procedry Soffit 14 positions. The darkness made positive identification impossible. The confusion of the evening had disrupted normal communication protocols. The men of the 18th North Carolina could only react to what they could see and hear in the immediate vicinity of their positions. What they saw were mounted figures moving deliberately through territory that might be controlled by the enemy. What they heard were voices speaking softly in the darkness, discussing matters they could not understand. What they feared was the approach of Union cavalry who had learned enough Confederate passwords to bluff their way through picket lines. In the darkness, distinction between friend and foe became a matter of split-second judgment by exhausted soldiers operating without adequate information or clear command guidance. At approximately 9 p.m. on May 2, 1863, Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson made the decision that would cost him his life. Against the advice of his staff officers, against the protocols of night warfare, Against every principle of command safety he had learned in 20 years of military service, he chose to conduct a personal reconnaissance of the ground between his advanced positions and the enemy lines. The decision was characteristic of Jackson's command philosophy. Throughout his career, he had insisted on seeing terrain with his own eyes before committing troops to battle. During the Shenandoah Valley campaign, he had personally scouted every mountain pass and river crossing. At 2nd Manassas, he had ridden forward under enemy fire to observe Union positions. His subordinates had learned to expect such behavior, but they had also learned to fear for his safety. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill, commanding the division that would spearhead any renewed assault, had been the first to suggest that the reconnaissance be postponed until dawn. The forest was too dark, the lines too confused, the risk too great. But Jackson was impatient to exploit the success of his flank attack. Union forces were retreating toward the Rappahannock River. A night assault might prevent them from establishing new defensive positions. Captain Richard Wilbourn of Jackson's staff had volunteered to conduct the reconnaissance, but Jackson refused the offer. He needed to see the ground personally, to understand the obstacles his men would face, to identify the routes that would allow Confederate artillery to support the attack. No subordinate could provide the tactical assessment he required. The reconnaissance party consisted of Jackson and 5 staff officers: Captain Wilbourn, Lieutenant Joseph Morrison, Jackson's brother-in-law, Captain William Forbes, Major Sandy Pendleton, and Sergeant George Tucker. They were mounted on horses selected for their dark coloring animals that would be less visible to Union pickets. Jackson rode in the lead on his sorrel horse, Little Sorrel, a mount so familiar to Confederate soldiers that its silhouette had become synonymous with victory. The horse was small, barely 15 hands high, but sure-footed and accustomed to gunfire. Jackson had ridden him through every major engagement since 1st Manassas. The party moved east along the Orange Plank Road at a walk, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of enemy movement. The forest pressed close on both sides. Fallen trees blocked portions of the road, forcing the riders to dismount and lead their horses around obstacles. The darkness was so complete that Jackson could barely see the outline of Captain Wilbourn's horse, although the captain rode only 10 feet ahead. Confederate picket lines were supposed to extend for 200 yards on either side of the road, but Jackson's party encountered no sentries during the first phase of their reconnaissance. The units Hill had positioned as security for the advance had become disorganized during the afternoon assault. Company commanders were still trying to locate their scattered men. Battalion officers were attempting to re-establish communication with regimental headquarters. As they approached the area where Union resistance had last been encountered, Jackson ordered the party to dismount. They left their horses with Sergeant Tucker and proceeded on foot, moving in single file along the southern edge of the road. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by dead leaves and forest debris. They reached a position approximately 3/4 of a mile east of Confederate lines. Through the trees ahead, Jackson could see the glow of Union campfires. The enemy was closer than he had expected, perhaps 400 yards. Between the Confederate and Union positions lay a stretch of open ground broken by a small creek and several farm buildings. Jackson studied the terrain for several minutes, noting the creek bed that would provide cover for advancing infantry, the barn that could serve as an assembly point for assault columns, the ridge line that would allow Confederate artillery to enfilade Union positions. The attack was feasible, but it would require careful coordination between infantry and artillery units. As they prepared to return to Confederate lines, Jackson heard the sound of movement to the north, men on foot, advancing through the underbrush with the deliberate caution of soldiers approaching enemy positions. The sound was too organized to be retreating Union troops, too quiet to be Confederate infantry moving to attack. Jackson suspected Union reconnaissance. The return journey began shortly after the reconnaissance was complete. Jackson remounted Little Sorrel and led his staff west along the plank road. They moved at a walk, maintaining noise discipline but eager to reach the safety of Confederate positions. The sound of their horses' hooves on the hard-packed dirt road seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence. They had covered perhaps 400 yards when they encountered Confederate picket soldiers from the 18th North Carolina Infantry positioned along the road. The exact nature of the challenge and response remains disputed among historical accounts. Some sources indicate proper military exchanges occurred. Others suggest that communication in the darkness was incomplete or misunderstood. What is certain is that the men of the 18th North Carolina had been expecting enemy cavalry throughout the evening. Reports of Union mounted troops operating behind Confederate lines had circulated among the pickets. The approaching riders matched their expectations of enemy reconnaissance. Whether a specific order to fire was given remains contested among historical accounts. Some sources attribute a direct command to Captain Barry. Others describe a spontaneous volley by nervous pickets who could not positively identify the approaching riders as friendly forces. The weight of evidence suggests that the precise circumstances of the decision to fire may never be definitively established. Jackson's party was approaching the picket line at close range when the fatal volley erupted from the darkness. Multiple rifled muskets discharged simultaneously from positions no more than 30 yards away. The .58 caliber and .577 caliber bullets struck horses and riders without discrimination. Jackson was hit by 3 rounds. One struck his left arm below the shoulder, another wounded his right hand. The third bullet struck his left shoulder, causing severe damage to bone and tissue. Little Sorrel reared and wheeled toward the Union lines, carrying his wounded rider directly into the path of low-hanging branches that struck Jackson across the face and chest. The reconnaissance that was intended to complete Confederate victory had instead eliminated the general who might have achieved it. The volley erupted from the darkness, with the simultaneous crash of multiple muskets fired at close range. Flames spurted from rifle barrels positioned no more than 30 yards from Jackson's reconnaissance party. In the space of seconds, the war's most successful flank attack collapsed into tragedy. The rifled muskets carried by the 18th North Carolina were deadly accurate at such range. The .58 caliber and .577 caliber bullets struck horses and riders with devastating effect, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the target before darkness returned. Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson absorbed 3 hits. The wounds to his left arm and right hand were severe, but not immediately life-threatening. The shoulder wound was catastrophic, damaging major blood vessels and bone structure. Blood immediately began flowing from the arterial injury, soaking through Jackson's uniform and dripping onto Little Sorrel's mane. The wounded horse reared in terror, wheeling toward the Union lines and carrying Jackson into low-hanging branches that struck him repeatedly across the face and chest. With his left arm useless and his right hand partially disabled, Jackson could not control his mount. The animal plunged through the undergrowth until Captain Richard Wilburn managed to seize the bridle and bring the horse to a halt. Behind them, the forest echoed with shouts of confusion and alarm. Major Sandy Pendleton's horse had been killed instantly, throwing the staff officer to the ground. Lieutenant Joseph Morrison's mount bolted into the darkness before the lieutenant could regain control. The carefully planned reconnaissance had become a scene of chaos and friendly fire. Within minutes, soldiers from the 18th North Carolina reached Jackson's position, realizing the magnitude of their error. The wounded officer they had shot wore the uniform of a lieutenant general. His horse and equipment marked him as a senior commander. The men who had fired began to understand that they had struck down one of their own generals. The regimental surgeon arrived shortly after the shooting and began emergency treatment by lamplight. Jackson's condition was critical but not immediately fatal. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily and required immediate attention to prevent shock and death from blood loss. A tourniquet was applied to the left arm to control arterial bleeding. Field medical treatment was primitive but adequate to stabilize Jackson for transport to proper surgical facilities. The general remained conscious throughout the initial treatment, occasionally giving orders to staff officers who had gathered around his position. He instructed Captain Wilbourn to locate General Robert E. Lee and report the situation. He ordered Major Pendleton to find the scattered elements of his corps and prepare them for defensive action. As word of the shooting spread through Confederate lines, the psychological impact became evident. Soldiers who had followed Jackson through a dozen victories stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that their commander had been struck down by his own men. The momentum that had characterized the afternoon assault began to dissipate as units lost coordination and purpose. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill reached Jackson's position within 30 minutes of the shooting. Hill now commanded Jackson's corps, 28,000 men scattered across miles of forest terrain, but Hill had no detailed knowledge of Jackson's plans for the night assault. He did not know which units were positioned where, which routes had been selected for the advance, which artillery batteries were available for support. Jackson, despite his wounds, attempted to brief Hill on the tactical situation. Speaking with difficulty, he outlined his assessment of Union positions and his plans for the next attack. But his voice was weak, his thoughts confused by pain and blood loss. Hill could understand only fragments of the general's instructions. The evacuation to medical facilities began approximately 2 hours after the shooting. Jackson was placed on a stretcher and carried through 3 miles of forest roads toward the Confederate field hospital at Wilderness Tavern. The route was difficult, rutted by artillery wheels and blocked by fallen trees. The stretcher-bearers were forced to halt repeatedly to clear obstacles from the path. During the evacuation, the bearers came under sporadic fire and had to seek cover, causing Jackson to be dropped at least once when the men carrying him dove for protection. The additional trauma may have contributed to the complications that would develop over the following days. Jackson reached the field hospital at Wilderness Tavern before midnight. Dr. Hunter McGuire, Jackson's personal physician, immediately began treatment for shock and blood loss, but the delay in reaching proper medical care had been significant. The wounds had been exposed to contamination during the roadside treatment and transport through the forest. Meanwhile, along the Orange Plank Road, Major General Hill struggled to reorganize Jackson's scattered corps. Without their legendary commander, the soldiers who had achieved the war's most brilliant tactical victory found themselves leaderless in enemy territory. The night assault that Jackson had envisioned was abandoned as Hill focused on consolidating his scattered units and establishing defensive positions. By midnight, the opportunity Jackson had been attempting to exploit was rapidly disappearing. Union forces under Major General John Sedgwick had begun crossing the Rappahannock River to reinforce Hooker's battered army. The confusion caused by Jackson's wounding had given Federal commanders time to organize their withdrawal and establish new defensive positions. The Battle of Chancellorsville would continue for 3 more days, ending in Confederate victory. But the cost of that victory, the loss of Stonewall Jackson, would prove greater than any defeat. Robert E. Lee would later write that he had lost my right arm when Jackson fell. The Confederate war effort had lost its most aggressive field commander to 3 bullets fired in error by men who trusted their general with their lives. The immediate tactical consequences of the shooting were felt within hours. Hill, lacking detailed knowledge of Jackson's reconnaissance and plans, could not coordinate the attack that might have completed the destruction of Hooker's army. The delay allowed Union forces to escape what could have been a complete disaster. Captain John Douglas Barry, whether or not he had given a direct order to fire, was relieved of command within days and sent to the rear suffering from acute nervous exhaustion. The psychological trauma of the incident had rendered him unfit for further military service. The men who had fired the fatal shots were quietly reassigned to other duties. Confederate military authorities wanted to minimize any reminder of the friendly fire incident that had cost them their most effective corps commander. The 18th North Carolina Infantry would complete the war under different leadership, carrying the burden of their inadvertent role in Confederate strategic defeat. Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson died 8 days after being shot by his own men. The immediate cause of death was reported as pneumonia, though modern medical analysis suggests that pulmonary embolism may also have contributed to his death. Dr. Hunter McGuire, Jackson's personal physician, performed the amputation of Jackson's shattered left arm during the early morning hours of May 3rd at the Confederate Field Hospital at Wilderness Tavern. The operation was conducted under chloroform anesthesia, contrary to some accounts that describe the surgery being performed without pain relief at the roadside immediately after the shooting. Jackson's condition remained stable for the first 4 days following the amputation. He was alert, coherent, and optimistic about his recovery. He discussed plans for future military operations and expressed confidence that he would return to field command within 6 weeks. The turning point came on May 6th, when Jackson complained of severe pain in his right side. Dr. McGuire's examination revealed symptoms consistent with pneumonia-labored breathing, high fever, and fluid accumulation in the lungs. The infection may have originated from the contamination of his wounds during the initial treatment and transport, or from complications arising from the extended surgical procedure. Jackson's final words, spoken on May 10th as he lapsed into unconsciousness, were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He died at 3:15 p.m., surrounded by his wife Anna and daughter Julia, who had traveled from Richmond to be at his bedside. The news of Jackson's death reached Confederate forces still engaged in the Battle of Chancellorsville on the evening of May 10th. Soldiers who had fought under Jackson's command for 2 years received the announcement in stunned silence. Many refused to believe their general was dead until they saw his body lying in state at the Virginia state capitol. Robert E. Lee's reaction to Jackson's death was immediate and profound. In a letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Lee wrote, "I have lost my right arm." Lee understood that Jackson's unique combination of tactical genius and aggressive independence could not be replaced. No other Confederate general possessed the ability to execute the audacious flanking maneuvers that had made Lee's army the most feared force in North America. The strategic implications of Jackson's death became evident during Lee's subsequent campaigns. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia remained formidable, but it never again achieved the operational flexibility that had characterized its greatest victories under the Lee-Jackson partnership. Lee was forced to adopt increasingly desperate strategies as Union numerical superiority began to assert itself. Major General A.P. Hill, who had assumed command of Jackson's corps after the shooting, was himself wounded by Union artillery on May 12th and evacuated from the battlefield. Command of the corps passed to Brigadier General J.E.B. Stuart, the cavalry commander, who lacked experience in large unit infantry operations. The command confusion that followed Jackson's death continued to affect Confederate operations throughout the remainder of the Chancellorsville campaign. The immediate tactical consequences of Jackson's shooting extended beyond the loss of a single commander. The night assault that Jackson had been planning was abandoned entirely, allowing Union forces to escape what might have been a complete disaster. Major General Joseph Hooker was able to withdraw his army across the Rappahannock River in good order, preserving the Army of the Potomac for future operations. Union military leadership initially dismissed reports of Jackson's death as Confederate propaganda designed to gain sympathy. Only after the war did Federal officers understand that they had lost their most dangerous opponent to an accident that no military strategy could have produced. The loss of Jackson was recognized by Union commanders as a significant strategic advantage that altered the balance of the war. The circumstances of Jackson's wounding friendly fire in the darkness of the wilderness highlighted the extreme dangers of night operations in close terrain. Military academies in both the United States and Europe studied the incident as an example of the communication failures and identification problems that made night fighting so hazardous. The development of improved field communication systems and recognition protocols in later decades was influenced by analysis of incidents like Jackson's death. Military forces learned to emphasize positive identification procedures and better coordination between units operating in close proximity during hours of darkness. Captain Richard Wilbourn, the staff officer who helped Jackson after the shooting, survived the war and later published detailed accounts of Jackson's final reconnaissance mission. Wilbourn's memoirs provided much of the definitive information about the circumstances of Jackson's wounding and death. The 18th North Carolina Infantry continued to serve with distinction throughout the remainder of the war, participating in major engagements at Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and Petersburg. The regiment's role in Jackson's death was not widely publicized during the war years, becoming better known only through post-war historical research and veteran memoirs. The Orange Plank Road where Jackson fell became a site of pilgrimage for Confederate veterans in the decades following the war. A monument was erected in 1888, funded by contributions from soldiers who had served under Jackson's command. The inscription commemorates Jackson's service without specifically mentioning the circumstances of his wounding. Modern historians continue to debate the broader implications of Jackson's death for Confederate military fortunes. Some argue that Jackson's aggressive tactics had become increasingly risky as Union forces improved their defensive capabilities. Others maintain that his loss deprived Lee of the tactical flexibility necessary to overcome growing Union advantages in men and material. The friendly fire incident that killed Jackson remains one of the most significant examples of how chance and confusion can alter the course of military campaigns. 3 bullets fired by nervous soldiers in the Virginia darkness eliminated the Confederate Army's most effective corps commander and fundamentally changed the trajectory of the American Civil War. The psychological trauma experienced by the soldiers involved in the shooting contributed to growing military understanding of the mental effects of combat. The concept that soldiers could be permanently disabled by psychological wounds, rather than only physical injuries, gained acceptance partly through documented cases of nervous breakdown following friendly fire incidents. The Battle of Chancellorsville ended in Confederate victory on May 6, 1863, but Lee's army had suffered casualties it could not afford to replace. More importantly, it had lost the general who might have been able to achieve the decisive victory that Confederate strategy required. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again possess the combination of tactical genius and operational audacity that had characterized the Lee-Jackson partnership. Jackson's death marked the beginning of the end for Confederate hopes of military victory. While Lee's army would continue to fight with distinction for nearly 2 more years, it would do so without the aggressive corps commander who had made possible its greatest triumphs. The shots fired by the 18th North Carolina Infantry on the night of May 2, 1863, were among the most consequential in American military history. What happened here was not merely a defeat, it was a lesson written in blood, studied by those who came after, and often ignored.